Here's a pattern almost every failed business shares: it wasn't built for the year things went wrong. It was only ever built for the year things were going right. A good quarter comes in, and the instinct is to spend it, reinvest everything, scale up, hire ahead of the curve, because growth is happening right now and waiting feels like leaving money on the table. Here's the question this video is actually asking: what if the best time to plan for a famine is during the feast, not after it starts? Maybe it's the year revenue doubled, and every dollar already has 3 projects competing for it before it even lands. Maybe it's the client who finally said yes after months of chasing, and the instinct is to immediately staff up around that one win as if it's guaranteed to repeat. Good years don't feel like the moment to hold anything back. That's exactly what makes them the moment it matters most. There's a man in Genesis who got put in charge of an entire nation's economy because of a single piece of advice, and the advice wasn't complicated. It was disciplined. By the time this happens, Joseph has already been sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused in Egypt, and forgotten in prison for years by the one person who promised to remember him. None of that qualifies him, on paper, to run a national economy. What actually gets him summoned to Pharaoh is a specific reputation: he interprets dreams accurately, and he tells the truth about what he sees, even when the truth isn't flattering or convenient. Pharaoh has 2 dreams that trouble him deeply, and Joseph is brought in to interpret them. Genesis 41 verses 29 to 30 records what Joseph tells him: 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. Notice what Joseph doesn't do here. He doesn't just deliver the forecast and walk away. Verse 33, "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt." Joseph turns a prediction into a plan, on the spot, before anyone asked him to. And the plan itself is almost embarrassingly simple. Verse 34, "Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance." Verse 35, "They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food." 20%. Not 50. Not everything you can squeeze out of a record harvest. A disciplined 1/5, set aside every single year of the good years, whether or not it felt necessary that particular year. Verse 36 names exactly why: this food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. Pharaoh puts Joseph himself in charge of executing it. Genesis 41 verses 47 to 49, "During the 7 years of abundance the land produced plentifully." Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Stop on that last detail for a second. Joseph stopped keeping records, not because he got careless, but because the reserve had grown past the point where counting it mattered anymore. That's 7 consecutive years of a young administrator sticking to a plan he made in year 1, through every single harvest, without anyone relitigating whether it was still necessary. No verse suggests Pharaoh's officials asked to revisit the 20% once the granaries were already overflowing in year 3 or 4. The plan simply ran, year after year, exactly as designed, because nobody treated a good year as a reason to stop. Here's what's easy to miss in that story: the discipline happened during the best 7 years Egypt had ever seen. Nobody around Joseph was asking, why are we holding back 1/5 of a record harvest? That's exactly the year it's hardest to save, when everything is working, when spending it all feels justified by the results, when the famine is still just a dream someone told you about. Proverbs 21 verse 5 names the general principle behind what Joseph did: the plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. Notice the pairing. It's not diligence versus laziness in that verse. It's diligence versus haste, a plan versus an impulse. Joseph's 5th wasn't slow or reluctant growth. Egypt still spent 80% of every harvest. It was a plan that survived contact with a good year, instead of getting quietly abandoned because the good year made it feel unnecessary. That's the actual test of a financial discipline, not whether you can keep it during a downturn, when fear does most of the enforcing for you, but whether you can keep it during the best quarter you've ever had, when nothing external is forcing you to. Think about how differently most businesses actually behave. A downturn arrives, and suddenly everyone becomes disciplined, budgets get cut, hiring freezes, spending gets scrutinized line by line. That discipline is real, but it's also easy, in a sense, because the crisis itself is doing the enforcing. Fear is an excellent motivator for a season. Joseph's story is asking about something harder, a discipline that holds during the 7 years nothing is forcing it to. Not fear-driven caution. A plan kept on purpose, in a season when keeping it required actual will rather than actual necessity. This is where a lot of business planning quietly fails, even in businesses run by genuinely careful people. The plan gets written during a lean season, when the danger feels close and the discipline feels obviously worth it. Then the lean season ends, revenue recovers, and the plan that felt essential 6 months earlier starts to feel like unnecessary caution holding the business back from opportunities it can clearly afford now. Nobody formally cancels the plan. It just stops being followed, one good quarter at a time, until the next famine arrives and there's nothing set aside to meet it with, the exact failure Joseph's 7 years were specifically designed to prevent. This isn't just an ancient administrative footnote. Warren Buffett has run Berkshire Hathaway for decades on a version of the same principle: hold a genuinely large cash reserve, even in years when markets are booming, growth stocks are surging, and financial commentators openly criticize him for sitting on capital instead of deploying it. That criticism shows up almost every bull market. Some version of, Buffett is falling behind, his cash pile is dead weight. And almost every time markets eventually turn, the pattern repeats. While other investors are forced to sell into a falling market to cover losses, Berkshire has been positioned to buy, at prices only available to someone who didn't spend their reserve chasing the previous rally. The reserve isn't idle. It's Joseph's fifth, just denominated in dollars instead of grain. Southwest Airlines ran a strikingly similar strategy in the 2000s, with fuel instead of cash. While oil prices were still relatively low and stable, Southwest's finance team locked in future fuel purchases at those low rates through long-term contracts, years before doing so looked urgent or necessary to anyone else in the industry. It would have been easy to skip, fuel was cheap, and hedging costs money up front for a problem that hadn't arrived yet. When oil prices spiked sharply later in the decade, that early discipline became one of the largest competitive advantages in American aviation. Airlines without a comparable hedge were suddenly absorbing fuel costs that Southwest had already locked away years earlier, during their own version of the 7 good years. Neither Buffett nor Southwest's finance team were quoting Genesis 41. But the shape of the decision is identical, right down to the timing, a discipline set aside, made during abundance rather than crisis, that only pays off later because it was kept even when nobody was demanding it and the math looked unnecessary at the time. So what does this actually look like this week, in your business specifically? First, pick your own fifth. It doesn't have to be 20%, pick a real, specific number that fits your business, and automate the transfer if you can, so the money leaves the account before you get a chance to talk yourself out of it during a genuinely good month. A percentage you have to remember and choose to honor every time gets renegotiated with yourself eventually. A percentage that moves automatically doesn't. Second, name what the reserve is actually for, the way Joseph named the famine before it ever arrived. Emergency fund is vague enough to raid the first time a tempting opportunity shows up, a piece of equipment on sale, a hire you could technically justify, a marketing push that feels urgent. 6 months of payroll if revenue drops by half, is specific enough to actually defend, even to yourself, when a good quarter makes spending it all feel completely justified in the moment. Third, revisit the plan specifically during your best months, not just your worst ones. That's when Joseph's discipline was actually tested, not in year 8, when the famine made saving obviously wise and nobody needed convincing, but in year 1, when the harvest was record-breaking and absolutely nobody would have blamed him for spending all of it on that year's opportunities instead. There's a fourth thing worth naming, Even though it's less of a step and more of a posture, hold the plan loosely enough to actually use it when the famine arrives. Joseph didn't store the grain to admire it. Genesis goes on to describe Egypt opening its storehouses and selling grain to neighboring nations during the famine. The entire point of the 7 years of discipline was the 7 years it made possible afterward. A reserve that never gets spent when the actual famine arrives isn't discipline anymore. It's just hoarding with better branding. The goal was never the pile of grain. It was surviving the 7 lean years, and helping others survive them too. This connects to something from the last video, on Sabbath and rest. Rest wasn't built into the design as a reaction to exhaustion, it was there from the very first week, before anyone had a reason to need it. Joseph's fifth works the same way. It wasn't a reaction to famine. It was set aside during the abundance, before the abundance ever ran out. Both are the same underlying instinct: build the boundary before the crisis makes it obvious, not after. Joseph wasn't given credit for predicting the famine. Pharaoh's magicians could have made a guess about that. He was given charge of Egypt for building a plan disciplined enough to survive 7 good years without being spent. That's the actual biblical case for business strategy, not clever forecasting, but a plan diligent enough to hold up during the very seasons that make it feel unnecessary. If this was helpful, next time we're going back to Genesis to look at what it actually says about work itself, and why work is the curse isn't the whole story. Subscribe if you want to keep building this with us.